Harold Simmons adjusted his worn straw hat as he stepped out of his dusty pickup truck. The California sun beat down on the Vineyard parking lot, its rays glinting off the polished luxury vehicles that surrounded his modest Ford. At 72, Harold's weathered face told the story of a life spent outdoors. Deep creases around his eyes from decades of squinting against the sun, skin tanned and textured like the soil he tended. His calloused hands, stained with the permanent mark of earth, closed the truck door with a familiar creak. Harold had never seen the need for new things when the old ones worked just fine. His faded blue flannel shirt had seen better days, patches carefully sewn over worn elbows by his own steady hands during quiet winter evenings. His canvas pants bore the subtle stains of grape juice and soil, badges of honor from his life's work. Harold paused to take in the elegant stone building of Cresthaven Vineyards. Its manicured gardens and ornate facades stood in stark contrast to the working vineyards he knew intimately. A slight smile crossed his face as he thought about the irony of his visit today. Few would guess that this unassuming elderly man supplied the award-winning Cabernet Sauvignon grapes that had put Cresthaven on the international wine map. For 47 years, Harold had cultivated what vineyard experts considered some of the finest grapes in Napa Valley. His 100-acre vineyard, inherited from his father and expanded through decades of careful investment, now supplied premium grapes to some of the most prestigious wineries in the country. The microclimate of his land, combined with techniques refined through generations, produced grapes with a complexity and character that wine connoisseurs raved about. Though few knew the humble source, Harold had never been one for showing off. When his vineyard's reputation began to grow in the 1990s, and the offers from luxury wineries started pouring in, he had simply reinvested the profits back into the land. While other successful growers built mansions and drove Italian sports cars, Harold stayed in the modest farmhouse where he was born, making only practical improvements to his equipment and facilities. His bank account told a different story than his appearance suggested. The previous year alone, his grape contracts had brought in over $4 million. His financial advisor had long ago given up trying to convince Harold to live a little with his substantial wealth. "I am living," Harold would say, "exactly the way I want to." Today's visit to Cresthaven wasn't business, at least not directly. After 5 years of supplying their premium grapes, Harold had yet to taste the final product. The latest vintage had won 3 international awards, and his curiosity had finally overcome his usual reluctance to leave his own fields. He wanted to experience firsthand what the fuss was all about. He patted his pocket, feeling the small notebook he always carried to jot down observations about soil, weather, and vines. Old habits died hard, and even on this rare day off, he found himself mentally cataloging the condition of Cresthaven's display vineyards as he walked past them toward the main building. The expansive tasting room entrance featured massive oak doors beneath a stone archway. As Harold pulled one open, cool air rushed out, a welcome relief from the afternoon heat. Inside, the ceiling soared 2 stories above a magnificent tasting bar crafted from reclaimed wine barrels and polished copper. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over patrons dressed in designer clothes, their jewelry catching the light as they swirled ruby liquid in delicate glasses. Harold removed his hat respectfully as he entered, running a hand through his silver hair before tucking the hat under his arm. He felt a momentary hesitation, an awareness of his outsider status in this temple of luxury, but quickly squared his shoulders. He knew more about what filled those glasses than most people here ever would. The subtle scent of oak and grape that permeated the air felt like home to Harold, though the marble floors and art-covered walls certainly didn't. He approached the tasting bar, where several young, impeccably dressed staff members served customers with practiced flourishes and elegant descriptions of flavor notes and terroir. A couple to Harold's left listened intently as a sommelier described the blackberry undertones and subtle hints of vanilla in their glasses. Harold smiled to himself. Those particular notes came from the western slope of his property, where the afternoon sun hit the grapes just so. He could have told them about the exact week of unusual weather 3 summers ago that had contributed to that vintage's unique character. As he waited for a staff member to notice him, Harold observed the room. Couples in designer clothing posed for photos with their wine glasses. A group of young professionals laughed loudly at a private table surrounded by bottles. A tour group followed a guide through the barrel room visible through a glass wall to his right. "First time at Cresthaven?" asked an elderly woman who had appeared beside him at the bar. Her silk blouse and tasteful pearls suggested she was a regular in places like this. "Yes, ma'am," Harold nodded politely. "Thought it was about time I saw what they do with my grapes." The woman's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly, but before she could respond, a young sommelier finally approached Harold's section of the bar. The name tag on his crisp black suit read Blake, and Harold couldn't help but notice how the young man's gaze briefly took in his worn clothing before offering a perfunctory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to Cresthaven Vineyards," Blake said, his tone noticeably less enthusiastic than the one Harold had heard him use with previous customers. "Are you looking for our standard tasting experience today?" "I was hoping to try the Reserve Cabernet, actually," Harold said, his eyes crinkling with unspoken amusement. "The 2021 that won the International Gold last month." Blake's expression flickered with surprise, perhaps at Harold's specific knowledge or perhaps at the fact that the Reserve tasting came with a significantly higher price tag than the standard option. "The Reserve tasting is $75, Blake said, his tone suggesting doubt about Harold's ability to afford such an experience. Harold nodded calmly. "That'll be just fine." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, extracting a platinum credit card that seemed incongruous with his farmhand appearance. He placed it on the counter between them. Blake's eyes widened almost imperceptibly at the card before he picked it up. "I'll get that started for you right away, Mr. Simmons." As the sommelier walked away to process the payment, Harold gazed at the wall behind the bar where bottles of Cresthaven's most prestigious wines were displayed like crown jewels. The 2021 Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon held the center position, its elegant label catching the light. Harold felt a swell of quiet pride knowing that his decades of early mornings, calloused hands, and weather-beaten face had contributed to something that brought people joy. He hadn't come for recognition. Harold had never needed applause to validate his work. He had come out of simple curiosity and perhaps a touch of sentimentality. At 72, he had begun to reflect more on his life's contributions, on the legacy of knowledge and care he would someday leave behind. Today was about connecting the beginning of the story, his soil and vines, with its end in these crystal glasses. Blake returned with the credit card and a forced smile. "Your tasting will begin shortly, Mr. Simmons. Feel free to have a seat at the bar." Harold nodded his thanks and settled onto a high leather stool, placing his worn hat carefully beside him. Through the window, he could see the perfectly maintained rows of demonstration vines that Cresthaven kept for visitors' photos. Beyond them, barely visible in the distance, were the actual producing vineyards, his vineyards in a sense where the real work happened. Blake returned carrying a single crystal glass of deep red wine, setting it before Harold with considerably less ceremony than he had observed the sommelier use with other guests. No presentation of the bottle, no story about the vintage, just a glass placed hastily on the counter. "This is our Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon," Blake said, his explanation rushed and perfunctory. "Enjoy your tasting." He immediately began to turn away. "Might you tell me a bit about its profile?" Harold asked politely, stopping the young man in his tracks. Blake turned back with poorly concealed impatience. "It has notes of blackberry and vanilla with an oaky finish," he said, the description so abbreviated that it might have been reading from the back of a cheap wine bottle. "The tannins are structured but not overwhelming." Harold nodded thoughtfully, lifting the glass to appreciate the wine's color against the light before taking a small sip. The complexity bloomed on his palate, far more nuanced than Blake's cursory description had suggested. Harold could taste the characteristic richness that came from his south-facing slopes, the hints of black cherry that always emerged from that particular section of his vineyard. "Quite nice," Harold commented. "I detect some black cherry as well. What elevation are these grapes grown at?" Blake glanced nervously over Harold's shoulder at a group of well-dressed patrons who had just entered. "About 400 feet," he answered vaguely, clearly eager to move on. "Excuse me for a moment." Harold watched as Blake practically bounded across the room to greet the newcomers. A group of 4 young professionals dressed in what Harold recognized as expensive casual attire. The sommelier's demeanor transformed instantly. His posture straightened, his smile widened, and his voice took on a warm, welcoming tone completely absent from his interaction with Harold. "Welcome to Cresthaven Vineyards," Blake exclaimed, loud enough that Harold could hear clearly from his seat. "We've been expecting you. I've reserved our premium tasting area for your group." Harold turned his attention back to his wine, taking another thoughtful sip. He wasn't offended. He'd experienced such treatment before. When you dressed as he did and carried the weathered face of decades working outdoors, people made assumptions. It was human nature, if not humanity's best quality. From the corner of his eye, Harold observed as Blake escorted the group to a private alcove with comfortable leather chairs and a dedicated server. The sommelier personally presented the first bottle, holding it reverently while delivering what appeared to be an extensive description of its characteristics. He even pulled out his phone to show them something, photos of the vineyard, perhaps, or reviews of the wine. An older couple dressed in matching polo shirts featuring another winery's logo approached the main bar, standing just a few feet from Harold. A different sommelier, a young woman with an elegant black dress and pearl earrings, immediately greeted them with enthusiasm. "First time at Cresthaven? We're so honored you chose to visit us today," she said warmly. "Would you prefer our standard flight, or were you interested in exploring our reserve collection?" "We're thinking of the standard flight," the man replied. "Excellent choice. Let me tell you about what makes our wines special." The sommelier launched into a passionate explanation about Cresthaven's history, their unique terroir, and the careful attention paid to each step of the winemaking process. Harold listened with interest. Her description was accurate and quite eloquent, though she neglected to mention the source of their most prized grapes. Few consumers ever thought about the farmers behind their wines, focusing instead on the winemakers who transformed the harvest into the final product. Harold had always been comfortable with this arrangement, preferring to let his grapes speak for themselves. After 15 minutes, Harold's glass was nearly empty, and Blake had yet to return. The standard practice at premium tastings, Harold knew from his research, was to guide guests through each wine, explaining its characteristics and answering questions. Instead, he sat alone, ignored, while Blake devoted his complete attention to the well-dressed group, now laughing appreciatively at something the sommelier had said. Harold caught the eye of the female sommelier who had been helping the couple. She noticed his empty glass but quickly averted her gaze, continuing her detailed explanation of the wine she was pouring for her customers. The message was clear: Harold wasn't the type of client worth prioritizing. A tall man in an expensive suit entered the tasting room, immediately commanding attention from the staff. The manager, Harold presumed, based on how the other employees straightened their postures when he appeared. The man scanned the room with a practiced eye, nodding approvingly at the group Blake was attending to before his gaze briefly passed over Harold without registering his presence. Harold considered raising his hand to request service but decided against it. After decades of nurturing temperamental vines through unpredictable seasons, he had developed patience as his defining characteristic. Instead, he took out his small notebook and began jotting down his impressions of the wine, comparing what he tasted to what he knew of how the grapes had grown that season. "Looking to learn about wine?" The question came from a young woman who had taken the seat next to Harold. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the unmistakable note of condescension that came with presumed expertise. "Always learning," Harold replied with a smile. "Been at it for about 50 years now, but there's always something new to discover." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, are you in the industry, then?" Before Harold could respond, Blake reappeared, addressing the young woman with immediate enthusiasm. "Ms. Reynolds, so wonderful to see you again. Your usual Chardonnay flight." "Yes, please, Blake. And whatever my friend here was drinking. He says he's been in the wine industry for 50 years. There was a hint of amusement in her voice that suggested she didn't quite believe Harold's claim. Blake glanced at Harold's nearly empty glass, then back at his worn clothing. Another reserve Cabernet for you, sir? The question carried a subtle tone of doubt. Yes, please, Harold said simply. Coming right up, Blake responded before turning back to Ms. Reynolds with a conspiratorial smile. And how was your trip to the French wine country? I saw your Instagram posts. Looked absolutely divine. It was incredible, she gushed. I brought back some techniques I'm dying to discuss with your winemaker. Is Christina here today? I'll check if she's available. She'd love to hear about your trip, Blake assured her before reluctantly turning to pour Harold's second glass. This time, Blake returned with the bottle, showing Harold the label, a courtesy that had been extended to every other customer Harold had observed. However, Blake performed this ritual hurriedly, almost mechanically, before pouring a much smaller portion than what other guests received. He then immediately turned his attention back to Ms. Reynolds, pulling out a tablet to show her photos of Cresthaven's newest release party, an exclusive event Harold hadn't been invited to despite being the grower of the celebrated grapes. We had the governor and several celebrities attend, Blake explained proudly to Ms. Reynolds. Very exclusive. Only our premium club members and industry VIPs. Harold sipped his wine slowly, observing the room with quiet interest. A tour group emerged from the barrel room, led by an enthusiastic guide gesturing dramatically as she explained the aging process. Our award-winning Cabernet spends 24 months in French oak barrels, developing its complex character and remarkable depth, she announced. What makes this particular Cabernet so special? Asked a tourist in an expensive camera. It's all about the terroir, the guide responded confidently. Our unique microclimate and soil composition create perfect growing conditions. That's why our 2021 vintage won 3 international gold medals. Harold smiled to himself. The guide wasn't wrong about the terroir, but she was describing his farm, not Cresthaven's demonstration vineyard. The unique microclimate was created by the natural windbreak of old-growth oak trees his grandfather had carefully preserved, and the perfect soil composition was the result of decades of Harold's meticulous cover cropping and organic amendments. As the afternoon progressed, Harold finished his second glass while Blake returned to check on Ms. Reynolds multiple times, refreshing her water, offering food pairings, and engaging in animated conversation about wine trends. Not once did he ask Harold how he was enjoying the Cabernet or if he had any questions. When a server passed with a tray of small appetizers designed to complement the reserve tasting, she offered them to everyone at the bar except Harold. The manager reappeared, making his way around the room to greet select guests. He stopped for an extended conversation with the group Blake had been attending to, then chatted warmly with Ms. Reynolds, but walked past Harold without acknowledgement. It wasn't malicious. Harold was simply invisible, deemed unworthy of the attention lavished on guests who fit the expected profile of a premium wine enthusiast. Harold glanced at his watch. He had been at the bar for nearly 45 minutes and had received the kind of rushed, minimal service usually reserved for closing time at a busy diner. The full reserve tasting experience, according to Cresthaven's website, included 5 premium wines with detailed explanations of each, a guided journey through their most celebrated offerings. Harold had received one hasty pour, then had to request a second glass that was served with obvious reluctance. A new group of visitors entered the tasting room, and Harold watched as staff descended upon them with attentive smiles and effusive greetings. One man in the group wore a polo shirt not dissimilar to Harold's flannel, yet Blake approached him with the deference Harold had been denied. The difference, Harold noted with wry amusement, was the gold watch on the man's wrist and the designer logo embroidered on his shirt, external markers of wealth that Harold had never bothered with. Harold considered leaving. He had tasted the wine, confirmed its quality, and experienced the tasting room ambience, albeit not in the way Cresthaven intended for its visitors. But something kept him in his seat. Perhaps it was simple curiosity about how long this treatment would continue, or perhaps it was the farmer's stubbornness that had served him well through 5 decades of agricultural challenges. 1 hour into what should have been a 30-minute premium tasting experience, Harold still sat at the bar with an empty glass. The tasting room had grown busier, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminating the animated conversations of wealthy patrons all around him. Every few minutes, Harold would catch Blake's eye, only to watch the sommelier deliberately look away and find another task to occupy himself. "Excuse me," Harold finally called out as Blake passed nearby with an armful of fresh glasses. The sommelier paused, his expression a careful mask of professional courtesy stretched thin over obvious annoyance. "Yes, sir? How was your Cabernet?" "Quite excellent," Harold replied truthfully. "I believe the reserve tasting includes 5 wines, though. I've only tried one." Blake's smile tightened. "Of course, we're just a bit understaffed today. I'll be with you as soon as I take care of these guests who have been waiting." He nodded toward a couple who had clearly arrived well after Harold, their designer shopping bags still fresh from a day of luxury purchases. "No rush," Harold said, though they both knew it wasn't true. He'd been rushed from the moment he walked in, but not in the way Blake meant. Harold watched as Blake set up an elaborate tasting for the couple, describing each wine with poetic detail and personal anecdotes about the winemaking process. This Merlot spent exactly 18 months in new French oak barrels, imparting those vanilla and spice notes you're experiencing. Blake told them with enthusiasm. "Our winemaker personally selected each barrel from a small cooperage in Burgundy." From his seat, Harold could see through the windows to the production area where crates of grapes from his farm were delivered each harvest. He remembered the meticulous care he took selecting which sections of his vineyard would go to Cresthaven, the southeastern slopes for morning sun exposure, the careful canopy management to achieve perfect ripening, the precise timing of the harvest to capture the optimal sugar levels and phenolic compounds. The clock on the wall showed 3:30 p.m. Harold had arrived at 2 p.m. 90 minutes of being overlooked, 90 minutes of watching others receive the experience he had paid for but was apparently not deemed worthy to receive. A new server, a young woman with a kind smile, approached Harold's section of the bar. For a moment, Harold felt a surge of hope that someone had noticed his prolonged wait. "Can I get you some water, sir?" she asked. "That would be lovely," Harold replied. "And perhaps continue with the reserve tasting I started quite some time ago?" The server's expression shifted to uncertainty. "I believe Blake is handling your tasting. Let me check with him." Harold watched as she approached Blake, who was now opening a bottle of sparkling wine with theatrical flourish for a group of young professionals taking selfies. The server spoke quietly to Blake, who glanced over at Harold with visible irritation before saying something that made the young woman nod and return to Harold. "Blake says he'll be with you shortly," she said apologetically. "Here's some water in the meantime." "Thank you kindly," Harold replied, taking a sip of the water. "Been here nearly an hour and a half now." The server's eyes widened slightly. "For the reserve tasting? That's usually complete in 30 minutes. "So I've heard," Harold said with a small smile that held no accusation. He'd learned long ago that kindness often achieved more than confrontation, especially with those who weren't directly responsible for the situation. "Let me see what I can do," she offered, but was immediately called away by another customer demanding attention. 2 hours now, Harold observed as 3 separate groups completed their entire tasting experiences, from welcome to farewell, during his wait. Blake continued to move efficiently around the room, charming guests and describing wines with passionate detail to everyone except the elderly farmer at the far end of the bar. Harold considered his options. He could leave, make a point by walking out. He could demand to speak with a manager, insist on the service he had paid for. But neither approach appealed to him. Throughout his life, Harold had found that patience often revealed people's true characters more effectively than confrontation. His thoughts drifted to his vineyard, to the thousands of vines that required years of patient tending before producing their first quality harvest. You couldn't rush a good grape any more than you could rush good character. Both revealed themselves in their own time. At 4:15 p.m., a tour bus arrived, disgorging 20 tourists who flooded into the tasting room with excited chatter. The staff mobilized immediately, rearranging the space to accommodate the large group. In the commotion, Harold found himself physically blocked from the bar by the new arrivals. His small space commandeered without so much as an "excuse me." "Sir, you'll need to move," said Blake, suddenly appearing beside Harold. "We need to use this section of the bar for the tour group." Harold looked at him steadily. I'm still waiting to complete my reserve tasting. It's been over 2 hours now. Blake's expression flickered between embarrassment and irritation. Right? Well, perhaps today isn't the best day for that experience. Would you like me to refund your tasting fee? The dismissal was so transparent that Harold almost laughed. I'm not in any hurry, he said instead. I'd be happy to wait until you have time to provide the experience as advertised. Blake's jaw tightened. Fine, let me find you another seat. He led Harold to a small table in the corner, far from the main tasting areas and partially blocked by a decorative wine barrel. I'll be with you when I can. Thank you, Harold said, settling into the chair that felt very much like being placed in timeout. From this vantage point, he could see Blake immediately return to the bar and begin an animated presentation for the tour group, pulling out bottles with flourish and describing each with passionate detail. Another 30 minutes passed. Harold sat quietly, observing the room with the patience of a man who had weathered countless seasons of unpredictable harvests. He watched as Blake occasionally glanced his way, clearly hoping to find the seat empty, only to quickly look away when he found Harold still waiting. At one point, the same kind server from earlier approached with another glass of water. I'm so sorry about the wait, she whispered. This isn't how we usually treat our guests. No need to apologize, Harold assured her. I've learned that how people treat those they believe can't benefit them says a lot more about their character than how they treat those they're trying to impress. She seemed taken aback by his insight, studying his weathered face with new interest. Can I bring you another glass of wine while you wait? On the house. That's very kind, but I'll wait for the proper tasting, Harold replied. I'm particularly interested in comparing your different vintages. She nodded and returned to her duties, occasionally casting sympathetic glances in Harold's direction as the afternoon wore on. By 5 p.m., the tasting room had reached its peak capacity. The noise level had risen considerably, with laughter and conversation echoing off the stone walls. Harold remained in his corner, now approaching the 3-hour mark of what should have been a brief experience. He thought about his farm, about the quiet evening routine that awaited him, checking the irrigation systems, walking the rows to monitor for signs of pests or disease, perhaps sitting on his porch with a simple glass of his neighbor's homemade wine as the sun set behind the hills. There was an honesty to that life that seemed absent in this performative space where worth was determined by appearance and status rather than substance. Harold's reflections were interrupted when a well-dressed older woman stopped by his table. Excuse me, she said with genuine warmth. Aren't you Harold Simmons? Harold looked up, surprised to be recognized. Yes, ma'am, I am. I thought so. I'm Margaret Wilson. We met at the Agricultural Association dinner last year. You gave that wonderful speech about sustainable farming practices. Harold's face brightened with recognition. Of course, Mrs. Wilson. How are your daughter's organic vegetable gardens coming along? Thriving, thanks to your advice about crop rotation. She beamed. What on earth are you doing sitting alone in the corner? Aren't you Cresthaven's primary grape supplier? Before Harold could respond, Blake appeared as if materialized by the mention of a VIP connection. Can I help you, Mrs. Wilson? He asked solicitously, completely ignoring Harold. Yes, you can explain why Harold Simmons is sitting neglected in a corner, she replied with unexpected sharpness. Do you have any idea who he is? Blake's expression remained blank. I'm sorry, is Mr. Simmons a friend of yours? He's only the reason your reserve Cabernet won those international medals, Mrs. Wilson said incredulously. His vineyard supplies your premium grapes. Harold watched with detached interest as Blake's face drained of color. The sommelier looked at Harold with new eyes, recognition dawning with horrifying clarity. Mr. Simmons? Blake stammered. I had no idea. No, you wouldn't have, Harold said calmly. There was no reason you should. I'm just a farmer in old clothes who asked for a wine tasting. Mrs. Wilson wasn't so forgiving. He's been sitting here for how long? Exactly? Blake swallowed hard. There was a misunderstanding. We've been unusually busy today. Not too busy for those people, Mrs. Wilson observed. nodding towards several groups who had arrived well after Harold but had received complete tastings. I think Christina would be very interested to hear about this. Is she here today? At the mention of the head winemaker, Blake's professional composure cracked further. She's in a meeting with Mr. Thurston. Perfect, Mrs. Wilson said with a smile that held no warmth. James Thurston should definitely hear about how his tasting room staff treats the man whose grapes form the foundation of his most profitable wines. She turned to Harold. Would you like me to get them? Or would you prefer to continue sitting in this corner being ignored? Harold considered the situation thoughtfully. For 3 hours, he had been deemed unworthy of basic courtesy because of his appearance. The staff had made assumptions about his knowledge, his finances, and his value as a customer based solely on his weathered face and simple clothing. Now, with a simple revelation of his identity, the dynamic had completely reversed. But Harold hadn't come seeking special treatment or recognition. He had simply wanted to taste the wines that his grapes had become, to complete a circle of creation that began with his hands in the soil and ended with the finished product in a crystal glass. I would still like to complete my tasting, Harold said finally. But there's no need to make a scene. I'm sure Blake can handle it from here. He met the sommelier's eyes with a steady gaze that communicated volumes. Blake's demeanor transformed so rapidly it was almost comical. The dismissive sommelier who had ignored Harold for 3 hours suddenly stood ramrod straight. His face a mixture of horror and obsequious panic. Mr. Simmons, sir, Blake stammered. Please allow me to escort you to our private tasting room immediately. I had no idea. This is completely unacceptable. It certainly is, Mrs. Wilson interjected, her protective instinct toward Harold evident in her stern tone. Perhaps you should get Christina and Mr. Thurston right away. Yes, of course, Blake agreed, now visibly sweating. Mr. Simmons, would you prefer to wait here while I've been waiting quite long enough, Harold said mildly. Why don't we all go together? I'd like to see the barrel room anyway. Blake nodded rapidly. Yes, sir. Right this way, please. As they walked through the tasting room, Harold noticed how other staff members registered the sudden change in his status. The young server who had brought him water caught his eye with a knowing smile, while others looked confused at the deferential treatment now being shown to the elderly man in worn clothing. They passed through the barrel room, where the rich aroma of aging wine and oak filled the air. In other circumstances, Harold would have paused to appreciate the neat rows of French oak barrels, each containing wine made from his grapes. Today, however, he simply followed Blake and Mrs. Wilson toward a door marked Private. Blake knocked on the door, then opened it after a muffled, "Come in." Inside, 2 people sat at a polished conference table, a striking woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and a distinguished man in his 60s wearing an expensive suit. Christina, Mr. Thurston, I'm sorry to interrupt, Blake began nervously. But Mrs. Wilson is here with Harold Simmons. The effect of Harold's name was immediate and dramatic. Christina, who Harold recognized as Cresthaven's celebrated head winemaker, stood abruptly, her eyes wide with surprise and delight. Harold Simmons? The Harold Simmons. She moved quickly around the table, extending her hand. This is an incredible honor. I've wanted to meet you for years. James Thurston, Cresthaven's owner, rose more slowly, his expression shifting from mild annoyance at the interruption to dawning recognition. Mr. Simmons, what an unexpected pleasure. We've never had the opportunity to meet in person. Harold shook their hands with the same calm dignity he'd maintained throughout the afternoon. Thought it was time I came to see what you folks do with my grapes, he said simply. Christina beamed. Your grapes are the foundation of everything we do here. The 2021 Reserve Cabernet. It won 3 international golds because of the exceptional fruit you provided. Mrs. Wilson cut in, her voice crisp with disapproval. While I'm sure Harold appreciates the recognition, perhaps someone should explain why he's been sitting in your tasting room for 3 hours receiving substandard service. 3 hours. Christina's smile fell away, replaced by confusion. I arrived around 2 o'clock for a reserve tasting, Harold explained. It seems today was particularly busy. Blake, who had been hovering uncomfortably in the doorway, turned an even deeper shade of red. "There was a misunderstanding," he began weakly. "What kind of misunderstanding keeps our most important grape supplier waiting for 3 hours?" Thurston asked, his tone dangerously calm. Blake looked at the floor. I didn't recognize Mr. Simmons. I assumed he was just what?" Christina interrupted sharply. "Just another walk-in visitor," Blake finished lamely, though everyone in the room understood the unspoken truth. He had judged Harold by his appearance and found him unworthy of proper attention. "I see." Thurston turned to Harold, genuine regret on his face. "Mr. Simmons, please accept my most sincere apologies. This is absolutely not how we conduct business at Cresthaven." Harold nodded. "Apology accepted. Truth be told, I wasn't expecting any special treatment. I just wanted to taste the wines." Christina shook her head in disbelief. "You should have received our absolute best service regardless of who we thought you were. The fact that you're Harold Simmons only makes this situation more mortifying." She turned to Blake with barely contained anger. "We'll discuss this later." "If I may," Harold interjected calmly. "I've been looking forward to tasting your wines all day. Perhaps we could focus on that now." Christina immediately shifted gears. "Of course, we can do much better than the standard reserve tasting." She turned to Blake. "Bring the library wines to the owner's suite, including the 2018 Vertical Series and the special barrel sample we were just discussing." Blake nodded and hurried away, clearly relieved to escape the tension in the room. "Mrs. Wilson, will you be joining us?" Thurston asked. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied with a satisfied smile. "Someone needs to make sure Harold finally gets the experience he deserves." As they walked to the owner's suite, a luxuriously appointed room with panoramic views of the vineyard, Christina walked beside Harold, her admiration evident. "Your farming techniques are legendary in the industry, Mr. Simmons," she said earnestly. "The consistency you achieve year after year, even with challenging weather conditions. It's remarkable. I've studied your irrigation management approach extensively. Just doing what my father taught me with a few improvements along the way," Harold replied modestly. They entered the suite, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of rolling vineyards stretching toward distant mountains. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the landscape, highlighting the precise rows of vines, some of which, Harold knew, were destined for his farm next season. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Thurston gestured to plush leather chairs arranged around a custom-made tasting table. "This room is usually reserved for our biggest investors and industry VIPs. Which is exactly what Harold is," Mrs. Wilson pointed out as she took a seat. "Though you'd never know it by how he dresses." Harold smiled good-naturedly. "Never saw much point in fancy clothes. They just get dirty on the farm." "A philosophy more people should adopt," Christina agreed, though her own attire suggested she didn't personally subscribe to it. Success should be measured by achievement, not appearance. A moment of awkward silence followed as everyone in the room reflected on the irony of her statement given the day's events. Blake returned with another staff member, both carrying trays laden with wines, glasses, and small plates of artisanal cheeses and charcuterie. The transformation in Blake's service was striking. Each bottle was presented with reverence, each glass placed with perfect precision. His hands trembled slightly as he lined up the wines in the proper tasting order. "We'll begin with our 2020 Reserve Chardonnay," Christina explained, taking control of the tasting. "While your vineyards supply our red varietals, I thought you might enjoy seeing our complete premium lineup." As Blake poured the first wine, Thurston leaned forward. "Mr. Simmons, I must tell you how embarrassed I am about today's situation. I've built Cresthaven's reputation on exceptional quality and service. What happened to you represents a significant failure on our part." "Every business has its off days," Harold replied generously. "Not like this," Thurston insisted. "Our relationship with you is the foundation of our most successful wines. The fact that you were treated poorly because you weren't recognized, because I look like a farmer?" Harold suggested mildly. "Well, that's what I am." "You're much more than that," Christina said firmly. "You're an agricultural artist. These wines wouldn't exist without your expertise." She raised her glass. "To Harold Simmons, whose hands in the earth create the foundation for everything we do." They all raised their glasses in toast, even Blake, whose expression remained a mixture of embarrassment and newfound respect. As they tasted through the lineup, Christina provided detailed explanations of each wine's production, frequently emphasizing how Harold's exceptional grapes contributed to the final product. For the Reserve Cabernet, the wine that had won international acclaim, she deferred to Harold, asking him to share insights about that particular growing season. "That was the year we had unusual spring rains followed by that perfect warm spell in June," Harold recalled, swirling the deep red liquid in his glass. "The vines struggled a bit early, but that stress actually intensified the flavor development later. You can taste it in the concentration." Christina nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. That struggle translated into incredible complexity. When those grapes arrived at the crush pad, I knew immediately we had something special." As the tasting continued, other staff members found reasons to visit the owner's suite, each introduced to Harold with pronounced deference. The young server who had shown him kindness earlier approached with a shy smile. "Mr. Simmons, I just wanted to say what an honor it is to meet you. My family has a small vineyard in Sonoma, and your sustainable farming articles have been incredibly helpful to us." Harold smiled warmly. "Glad to hear it. What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied. "Well, Sarah, if you ever have questions about those techniques, you're welcome to visit my farm. Always happy to help the next generation." The genuine offer, delivered without pretense, seemed to highlight the contrast between Harold's authentic generosity and the superficial values that had led to his earlier treatment. Throughout the tasting, Blake remained subdued, performing his duties with meticulous care but avoiding direct eye contact with Harold. The sommelier's humiliation was palpable, his earlier arrogance replaced by the uncomfortable recognition of his profound misjudgment. After they had tasted through the standard lineup, Christina disappeared briefly and returned with a dusty bottle lacking a formal label. "This is something truly special," she said with evident excitement. "We've never released this publicly. It's an experimental batch from 2017, made exclusively from the fruit from your northeastern slope. We only produced 30 bottles." She carefully decanted the wine while explaining the unique fermentation process they had used. As she poured small measures into fresh glasses, her reverence for both the wine and its origins was evident. "We call this our Founder's Reserve, though perhaps it should be called Farmer's Reserve in your honor," she said, passing a glass to Harold. Harold accepted the glass, holding it up to the light to admire its deep garnet color before inhaling its complex bouquet. The room fell silent as he took his first sip, everyone watching for his reaction. He closed his eyes briefly, savoring the experience. When he opened them, genuine appreciation shone in his gaze. "Now that," he said quietly, "is quite something. You've captured exactly what that section of land can produce when everything aligns perfectly." Christina's face glowed with professional pride. "It wouldn't exist without your grapes, Harold. This is the purest expression of what happens when exceptional farming meets careful winemaking." As the private tasting concluded, James Thurston rose from his chair with the deliberate movement of a man making an important decision. The sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across the elegant room as evening approached. "Mr. Simmons, Harold, if I may, would you join me for a brief walk through the vineyard? There's something I'd like to discuss." Harold nodded, setting down his empty glass. "I'd enjoy that." As they excused themselves, Christina pulled Blake aside. Though they spoke in hushed tones, the tension in their conversation was evident. Blake's shoulders slumped further with each passing moment. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Outside, the cooling air carried the sweet scent of ripening grapes and rich soil. Harold and Thurston walked in companionable silence for a moment, both men naturally attuned to the rhythms of the vineyard around them. "I'm not going to waste your time with more apologies," Thurston finally said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. "What happened today was inexcusable, and I'm deeply embarrassed that a man of your significance was treated so poorly in my establishment." "We all make mistakes," Harold replied simply. Thurston shook his head. "This wasn't just a mistake. It represents a fundamental flaw in how we operate." He paused, looking out over the rows of carefully tended vines. "Do you know what bothers me most about today's situation?" Harold waited, allowing the other man to collect his thoughts. "It's not just that we failed to recognize our most important supplier," Thurston continued. "It's that we treated any guest that way based solely on appearance. That's not the culture I thought I was building here." They reached a viewpoint overlooking the valley, where the setting sun gilded the landscape. Below them, visitors were still enjoying themselves on the tasting room patio, unaware of the profound conversation taking place above. "You know," Harold said thoughtfully, "in farming we have a saying, 'The strength of the harvest is determined by the weakest vine.' You can have acres of perfect fruit, but if you neglect even a small section, problems will eventually spread." Thurston nodded slowly. "And today we showed you our weakest vines." "Looks that way," Harold agreed. "But the good news about weak vines is they can be strengthened with proper attention." "That's precisely what I intend to do," Thurston said with renewed resolve. "Starting tomorrow, we're implementing comprehensive changes to our training protocols and service standards." They turned back toward the main building, walking at the unhurried pace of men accustomed to allowing ideas to develop naturally. "I'd like your input, if you're willing," Thurston continued. "No one understands the connection between appearance and value better than a farmer. You know that the most unprepossessing soil can produce extraordinary fruit." Harold smiled at the apt metaphor. "I'd be happy to contribute, though I suspect you already know what needs to be done." "I do," Thurston acknowledged. "But having you involved would send a powerful message to our staff." As they approached the main building, they could see through the windows that the tasting room had calmed considerably. The tour groups had departed, leaving only a few couples enjoying the last pours of the day. Inside, they found Christina waiting with an ashen-faced Blake, whose earlier cockiness had been replaced by the demeanor of a man awaiting sentence. "Blake has something he'd like to say to you, Mr. Simmons," Christina announced, giving the sommelier a pointed look. Blake stepped forward, visibly struggling to maintain eye contact. "Mr. Simmons, I want to apologize personally for my inexcusable behavior today. I made assumptions based solely on your appearance, and I failed to provide the service our winery promises to every guest." He swallowed hard. "There's no excuse for my actions, and I'm truly sorry." Harold studied the young man thoughtfully. The transformation was remarkable, from dismissive arrogance to genuine contrition in the space of an afternoon. But was it sincere, or merely the panicked response of someone who had been caught mistreating an important person? "Thank you for your apology," Harold said carefully. "May I ask you something, Blake?" The sommelier nodded, bracing himself. "If I came back tomorrow dressed exactly the same way, but you knew who I was from the start, would you treat me differently than you did today?" "Of course, sir," Blake answered immediately. Harold shook his head. "That's not the right answer." Blake looked confused, glancing at his superiors for guidance. "The right answer," Harold continued gently, "is that you would treat me exactly the same as any other guest, with respect, attention, and professionalism, regardless of whether I'm a grape supplier, a wealthy investor, or just an old farmer curious about wine." Understanding dawned in Blake's eyes. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Simmons. I see that now." "Do you?" Harold asked. "Because that's the real issue here. Not that you failed to recognize me, but that you believed recognition should determine the quality of service a person receives." Thurston stepped forward. "Harold is making the exact point I was about to address. Blake, your position at Cresthaven is going to change effective immediately." Blake paled. "Sir, please, I need this job." "I'm not firing you," Thurston clarified. "That would be the easy solution, but it wouldn't solve the underlying problem." Christina nodded in agreement. "Instead, you're being reassigned to work directly with me for the next 3 months. Half your time will be spent in the vineyard, learning firsthand about the agricultural foundation of everything we do here. The other half will be spent developing a new training program for all customer-facing staff, one that emphasizes equal respect for every guest. And, Thurston added, Mr. Simmons has generously agreed to consult on this program, sharing his unique perspective on how appearances can deceive. Blake looked stunned. You're giving me a chance to fix this. We're giving Cresthaven a chance to fix this, Christina corrected. With your direct involvement, since you've now experienced both sides of the problem, causing it and feeling its consequences. Harold observed the exchange with quiet approval. Redemption always held more power than punishment. Another lesson he'd learned from decades of nurturing troubled vines back to health rather than simply removing them. There's one more thing, Thurston said, turning to Harold. We'd like to establish an annual scholarship in your name for aspiring viticulturists from working-class backgrounds. These students would receive education, mentorship, and hands-on training here at Cresthaven. Would you be willing to lend your name to such a program? Harold hadn't expected this. Throughout his career, he had quietly helped many young farmers get started, offering advice and sometimes financial assistance, but always without fanfare. Public recognition had never been his goal. That's not necessary, he began. It's not about necessity, Christina interjected warmly. It's about legacy. Your approach to farming deserves to be passed down to future generations. Harold considered the proposal. On one condition, he finally said. The students selected must spend their first week working in the tasting room, learning that quality service isn't determined by a customer's appearance or status. Thurston smiled, extending his hand. Agreed. The Harold Simmons Viticulture Scholarship will embody that principle from day one. As they shook hands, Mrs. Wilson, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, nodded with satisfaction. Now that's what I call a proper resolution, she declared. Though I still think you got off easy, young man, she added, fixing Blake with a stern look. Blake nodded earnestly. I know I did, ma'am, and I won't waste this opportunity. The tasting room had emptied now, the last guests departing as closing time approached. Through the windows, the vineyard glowed in the golden light of sunset, rows of vines stretching toward the horizon like lines in a well-crafted story. Sarah, the kind server who had shown Harold courtesy earlier, approached with a carefully packaged bottle. Mr. Simmons, Christina asked me to prepare this for you to take home. It's the Founder's Reserve we tasted earlier. That's very thoughtful, Harold said, accepting the gift. And Sarah, I meant what I said about visiting my farm if you have questions. Vineyards need young people with good hearts tending them. I'd be honored, she replied sincerely. My family would never believe I met the Harold Simmons. As preparations for Harold's departure continued, Blake approached him once more, his demeanor markedly different from their first interaction hours earlier. Mr. Simmons, there's something I haven't told you, he said, his voice quiet but steady. My grandfather was a farmer too, not grapes but apple orchards in Washington state. He dressed a lot like you, actually. When I moved to California and got into the wine industry, I guess I wanted to distance myself from those roots, to seem sophisticated and knowledgeable. Harold studied the young man with new understanding. Sometimes we run so far from who we are that we lose the best parts of ourselves along the way. Blake nodded, a flash of recognition in his eyes. That's exactly what happened. Seeing how you carried yourself today, with such dignity despite how I treated you, it reminded me of my grandfather. He had that same quiet confidence. Sounds like a man I would have enjoyed knowing, Harold said. I think he would have enjoyed knowing you too, Blake replied, something genuine emerging from beneath his polished exterior for the first time. As the group walked Harold to his truck in the now empty parking lot, the transformation that had taken place over the course of the afternoon was palpable. What had begun as a simple desire to taste wines made from his grapes had catalyzed significant changes, not just in how one employee treated customers, but in the fundamental values of the entire establishment. Thurston insisted on loading Harold's gift basket into the truck himself, a small gesture that symbolized a larger shift in perspective. Christina provided her direct contact information, promising to consult with Harold on future vintages made from his grapes. Even Blake seemed changed, the humbling experience having cracked the veneer of pretension to reveal something more authentic beneath. "We'll be in touch about the scholarship program," Thurston promised as Harold climbed into his truck. "And I hope you'll consider becoming a more regular visitor. Perhaps we could arrange a joint tasting event featuring both your farming expertise and our winemaking." "I'd like that," Harold agreed, starting the engine. "Though I'll probably still dress like this," he added with a gentle smile, gesturing to his worn flannel and canvas pants. "We wouldn't have it any other way," Christina assured him. As Harold's truck pulled away, the dust from the gravel drive catching the last rays of sunlight, Blake stood watching with an expression of thoughtful reflection. The lesson he had learned today, that true value lay beneath surface appearances, would forever change how he approached not just his work, but his understanding of people. Back at Cresthaven, Thurston wasted no time in calling an emergency staff meeting. All employees, from the newest server to the most experienced wine educator, gathered in the barrel room as their boss outlined the changes that would be implemented immediately. "Today, we failed to live up to our most basic responsibility, to treat every guest with equal respect and attention," he began solemnly. "But from this failure, we have an opportunity to transform not just our procedures, but our entire approach to hospitality." As Thurston described the incident and the new initiatives that would follow, including the scholarship program and revised training protocols, the staff listened with varying degrees of surprise and concern. Some exchanged guilty glances, recognizing their own tendency to judge guests by appearance, while others nodded in earnest agreement with the proposed changes. "Starting tomorrow," Thurston concluded, "we operate under a new fundamental principle. The worth of our guests is inherent in their humanity, not their attire, status, or spending potential. And to help us implement this change, we'll be working directly with Harold Simmons himself, the man whose grapes form the foundation of our most celebrated wines, and whose dignity in the face of disrespect has shown us a better way forward." 6 months later, Harold's truck once again pulled into Cresthaven's parking lot. This time, however, there was no uncertainty in his approach. As he stepped out, wearing the same worn flannel shirt and canvas pants that had once caused him to be overlooked, he noticed something different. A small, elegant sign near the entrance that hadn't been there before. "The Harold Simmons Tasting Room," it read, "where every guest is treated with the same care we give our finest grapes." Harold shook his head with a modest smile as he approached the entrance. Inside, the tasting room was buzzing with visitors, but the atmosphere had subtly changed. Servers were attentive to every guest, regardless of appearance. An elderly couple in simple clothing received the same detailed wine explanations as a group of obviously wealthy tourists. Blake, dressed in clothes that combined professional elegance with practical functionality, was leading a special tasting. Harold noticed soil under the young man's fingernails, evidence of his time working in the vineyard. "Mr. Simmons," Blake called out, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Everyone, this is Harold Simmons himself," he announced to his group, "the farmer whose exceptional grapes make our award-winning wines possible." The group turned with interest, several raising their glasses in spontaneous toast. Harold nodded in acknowledgement, touched by the gesture. "Our first scholarship students arrive next week," Blake told him eagerly. 3 young people from farming backgrounds who might never have had the opportunity otherwise. Christina emerged from the barrel room, warmly greeting Harold. "Your influence extends far beyond our walls now," she said. 3 other wineries have adopted similar training programs after hearing about our experience. The ripple effect has been remarkable." As Harold joined a tasting, he observed Sarah, now promoted to lead server, explaining to a group how the soil and farming techniques affected the wine they were sampling. "The wisdom of farmers like Harold Simmons is in every sip," she told them. The transformation was complete and genuine. What had begun as a simple desire to taste wines made from his grapes had evolved into something far more significant. A fundamental shift in how an entire industry viewed the relationship between appearances and worth. As Harold drove home that evening, watching the sun set over his beloved vineyard, He reflected on the invisible connections that bind us all. From the humble soil to the celebrated wine, from the weathered farmer to the elegant tasting room. Each played an essential role in a story of creation and transformation. Sometimes, he thought, the most powerful changes begin with the simple act of being yourself in a world that expects you to be someone else.